Have you ever calculated the true cost of being the successful one in the family? I'm not talking about the price of gifts or the occasional loan. I mean the invisible tax levied on your achievements, the unspoken expectation that your success is no longer just your own, but a communal safety net. That evening, at my father's 65th birthday party, I was beginning to understand that this tax was higher than I could have ever imagined. The air in my father's Boston home was thick with the comforting scent of Susan's roasted chicken and the slightly musty smell of old books that clung to every surface. Laughter bounced off the walls, genuine but brittle, like thin glass. For 15 years since Susan married my father, we had perfected this performance of a happy, blended family. We knew our lines, our cues. It was a play I was happy to star in, most of the time. My father, Michael, a retired history professor with a mind full of ancient worlds and a charming inability to manage his present-day finances, was glowing. Susan, his wife and my stepmother for half my life, fussed over him, her presence a warm, steady hum in the room. Her two sons, my stepbrothers, were there, of course. Liam, 28, and Noah, 26. Good guys. Kind even. But they were adrift in the placid sea of their late 20s, still finding themselves on a tide, funded by their mother's patience and my father's pension. To Dad, I raised my glass of wine, 65 and more brilliant than ever. A chorus of cheers echoed me. I watched my father's eyes crinkle at the corners. He was a good man, a man who had been shattered by my mother's death when I was a teenager and then painstakingly put back together by Susan. For that, I would always be grateful. But what do you do when gratitude starts to feel like a debt you can never finish paying? After dinner, it was time for presents. Liam and Noah proudly presented a high-end electric razor, a practical and thoughtful gift. My father thanked them profusely. Then it was my turn. I handed him a simple, elegant envelope. He slid a finger under the seal and pulled out the contents. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to stunned silence. His eyes scanned the documents, then shot up to meet mine. Inside were 2 first-class plane tickets to Rome and confirmations for a 2-week, curated historical tour of Italy, focusing on the Roman Empire. It was the trip he had talked about his entire academic life, the one he and my mother had always planned but never took. The one he and Susan could never afford. Ava, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, I said softly. Just go. See the Forum. Walk the Appian Way. Across the room, the atmosphere had shifted. Susan's eyes were glistening with happy tears for her husband, but the expressions on Liam and Noah's faces were more complex. It was admiration, yes, but it was painted over a canvas of something else. Envy? No, that was too harsh. It was a look of profound, almost resigned separation. It was the look of people on the shore watching a ship they could never hope to board sail away. Wow, Ava, Liam said, breaking the silence. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he always used when he was impressed or nervous. That's just wow. You're a miracle worker. Noah just nodded, his mouth slightly agape. A surgeon's salary, man, he murmured, as if to himself. Must be nice. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it landed like a stone in my gut. They weren't just seeing a gift from a daughter to her father. They were seeing a display of financial power they didn't have. My success, the result of a decade of brutal residency, sleepless nights, and a mountain of student loans I was still paying off, was being simplified into a magical, inexhaustible resource. It was the family ATM, the get-out-of-jail-free card. I had wanted the moment to be about my father's dream, but I had inadvertently made it about my money. And in that quiet, gift-strewn living room, a terrifying new dynamic was being cemented. I wasn't just Ava, the daughter. I was Ava, the solution. And I had no idea how soon they would be coming to collect. What's the difference between a crisis in the operating room and one in your personal life? In the OR, the rules are clear. The enemy is the disease, the objective is the patient's life, and your tools are steel, science, and a steady hand. In life, the lines are blurred. The enemy often looks like family, and your steady hand can start to shake. 3 weeks after my father's birthday party, I learned that difference in the most brutal way possible. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office dictating notes after a complex tibial osteotomy, a procedure that had gone perfectly. I felt that clean, satisfying sense of accomplishment, of a problem identified and solved. My world was orderly. Then my phone buzzed, displaying Susan's name. I smiled, expecting a question about the Italy trip. I was wrong. Ava? Her voice was a ragged tear in the fabric of my calm afternoon. It wasn't the warm, steady voice I knew. This was the sound of a person whose world had just been kicked out from under them. A choked sob followed. Susan, what is it? What's wrong? I swiveled in my chair, my entire body going on high alert, the surgical focus instantly snapping from a healed bone to a new, unseen wound. They found something, she whispered, the words fractured by tears. The tests came back. It's cancer, Ava. A rare kind. My doctor, he said. She couldn't finish, her breath hitching. In that moment, I wasn't her stepdaughter. I was a doctor. My brain, trained for crisis, began to build a firewall between emotion and action. I needed data. Okay, Susan. Breathe. Tell me the name. Tell me the exact diagnosis they gave you. She managed to get it out between sobs. A high-grade pleomorphic sarcoma. A nasty, unpredictable cancer. And then came the second blow. The standard chemotherapy protocols were less effective against this subtype. Her best hope, her oncologist had said, was a new experimental immunotherapy treatment. A treatment her insurance company, after a 5-minute phone call, had already classified as elective and refused to cover. My mind was already racing, flipping through the mental Rolodex of oncologists, researchers, and hospital administrators I'd accumulated over 15 years in medicine. The human part of me felt a cold dread creep up my spine for this kind woman who had so gently healed my father's broken heart. But the surgeon in me had already scrubbed in. This was a new kind of operation, and I was the lead. Listen to me, Susan, I said, my voice calm and firm, the one I used to reassure patients before they went under anesthesia. Don't panic. A prognosis is a statistic, not a destiny. I'm going to look into this. I know people. I'm going to find the best sarcoma specialists in the country. We will get a second opinion, maybe even a third. You are not alone in this. For the next several hours, I didn't think about the cost, the insurance, or the trip to Italy. I was a physician on a mission. I emailed a colleague at Dana-Farber. I pulled up clinical trial databases. I read 3 different white papers on her specific type of cancer. I was in my element, navigating the complex, terrifying labyrinth of the medical system for them. I would map the path, find the experts, and coordinate the attack. I would do what I do best. I was the solution. That night, I finally called my father and a distraught Susan back, armed with a plan and the names of 2 top specialists. I had given them a direction, a flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness. I believed I was helping them navigate the storm. I had no idea I was about to be named its sole financier. There's a strange, sterile confidence that comes from arranging medical care. You make the calls, you pull the strings, you set the appointments. You feel a sense of control, as if you're corralling chaos into an orderly procession of consultations and scans. For 2 weeks, that was my reality. I managed Susan's case like I would any complex orthopedic surgery, with precision, planning, and a complete focus on the desired outcome. But what happens when the neat, predictable world of medicine collides with the messy, emotional chaos of family finances? The bill arrived not with a thud in the mailbox, but as a tremor in my father's voice over the phone. I was driving home from the hospital, the city lights blurring into streaks of red and gold. "Ava, can you come over?" he asked. There was no preamble, no small talk, just a raw, frayed edge to his voice that immediately put me on alert. "I'm on my way. What's wrong? Is it Susan?" I asked, my heart rate kicking up a notch. "No, no, she's resting. It's something else. A letter. Just, please come." When I walked through their front door 20 minutes later, the scene was one of quiet devastation. My father was sitting at the dining room table, a single sheet of paper in front of him as if it were a death sentence. He looked older than he had at his birthday party just weeks before. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Susan was nowhere in sight. "Dad? What is that?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the crisp white sheet. He slid it across the polished wood surface without a word. I picked it up. It was an invoice from the specialist's office in New York, the one I had pulled a major favor to get Susan into. It detailed the initial consultation, the advanced genetic sequencing on her tumor, and a battery of specialized imaging. At the bottom of the page, in bold black ink, was the total: $52,743. The number seemed to vibrate on the page. It was an obscene amount for a preliminary workup, but in the stratosphere of experimental oncology, it was just the cost of admission. "They want this before they'll even schedule the first infusion," my father said, his voice a hollow whisper. He wasn't looking at me, but at the paper, as if it were an accusation. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. This is the entry fee." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, terrifying helplessness I had never seen in him before. This was a man who could lecture for 3 hours on the fall of the Byzantine Empire, but he was utterly defeated by a single number on a piece of paper. "We can't, Ava," he choked out, shame coloring his face a deep red. "We just can't. The pension, it's enough to live on, barely. Our savings, after we paid off the house, there's less than $10,000. That's it. That's everything." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I'm going to lose her because I can't afford to save her." In that moment, the problem ceased to be financial. It was a medical emergency. My father was hemorrhaging hope, and I was the only one in the room who knew how to stop the bleeding. I didn't hesitate. Did a surgeon pause to check a patient's credit score before closing a wound? I walked over, placed a hand on my father's shaking shoulder, and pulled out my phone. "It's okay, Dad. It's okay. We'll handle it." My fingers moved quickly across the screen, navigating to my bank's app, my thumbprint authorizing the transfer. It was a staggering amount of money, more than the down payment on my condo. But seeing my father broken was a cost I was unwilling to bear. A few taps, a confirmation screen, and it was done. "It's paid," I said, my voice steady. "Consider it a one-time thing, an emergency. Now we can focus on getting Susan well." He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief, relief, and a profound, soul-crushing gratitude. I thought I had solved the problem. The truth is, I had just bought it. Have you ever been summoned to a meeting where you were unknowingly the main course? That's what it felt like that Sunday afternoon. My father had called for a family sit-down to discuss next steps for Susan. The 4 of them were already in the living room when I arrived. The air, once filled with the warmth of a birthday celebration, was now cold and sterile with unspoken anxieties. It wasn't a family gathering, it was a tribunal. Susan was curled on the sofa, wrapped in a thick afghan, looking pale and fragile. My father paced in front of the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, the picture of a worried academic. Liam and Noah sat in matching armchairs, their postures unnervingly straight, their faces set with a strange, rehearsed seriousness. They looked like two young men about to pitch a risky startup. As it turned out, I was the sole investor they were targeting. My father cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. Thank you for coming, Ava. We all know why we're here. Susan's health is the only thing that matters. And we're so, so grateful for what you did. He gestured vaguely, referring to the $52,000 hole I had just blown in my savings. But that was just the start. We need a sustainable plan, a way forward, together. He faltered, looking at his stepsons for support. He was a man of history, not of hard conversations. Liam leaned forward, seizing the opening. His voice was smooth, confident, the voice of someone who believes they have found the perfect, elegant solution to a messy problem. Dad's right. We have to face this as a single unit, as a family. We were talking, and it's clear that we all have different strengths we can bring to the table to help Mom. He paused, making eye contact with each of us. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This was a speech. And I knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, what was coming next. So here's what we were thinking, he continued, steepling his fingers. We need a common fund, a central account for all of Mom's medical expenses, and we should all contribute based on our ability. Ava, you have the most successful career. You're a brilliant surgeon. It's only logical that you would take the lead on the financial side of things, that you would be the primary contributor. The words, so calm and rational, landed like grenades in the quiet room. He wasn't asking. He was assigning. He wasn't finished. And Noah and I, we'll be the support team. We'll handle everything on the ground. We'll drive Mom to her appointments, even the ones in New York. We'll do the grocery shopping, the cooking. We'll manage her care at home so you don't have to worry about a thing. We'll contribute our time and our effort. You contribute the money. It's a team effort. Everyone gives what they can. Noah nodded along enthusiastically. Yeah, you're the spearhead, Ava. We're the shaft. The silence that followed was deafening. My brain, the surgeon's brain, was doing a cold, swift calculation. They were offering to perform basic household chores and provide transportation. In exchange, they were asking me to shoulder a financial burden that could easily climb into the high 6 or even 7 figures. A cost that would indefinitely postpone my own future, mortgage my career, and drain the resources I had fought so hard to build. They had taken my one act of emergency aid and interpreted it as a permanent line of credit. I looked at my father, my last hope. I searched his face for a sign of protest, for a flicker of defense for his own daughter. I found none. Instead, I saw a profound and desperate relief. He saw a solution, an escape from the financial abyss that terrified him. He was a good man, my father, but he was drowning. And in that moment, he was willing to let his sons hand me an anchor if it meant he could get a breath of air. They had just invented a new kind of family, one where I was no longer a daughter, but an endowment. How long does it take for a family to become a pack of wolves? Not long, apparently. The silence that followed Liam's proposal was absolute, the kind of heavy, vacuum-sealed silence that follows an indecent proposal. My ears were ringing. I looked from Liam's earnest, confident face to Noah's expectant nod. I was the spearhead. They were the shaft. The crude metaphor hung in the air, a perfect summary of their obscene proposition. I felt like I was going to be sick. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the surgeon's calm to descend over the screaming chaos in my head. I think, I began, my voice dangerously steady, that there's been a misunderstanding of my financial situation. I kept my eyes on Liam, the self-appointed CEO of this family crisis. I was happy to pay that first bill. It was an emergency. But what you're suggesting, this common fund, it's not a sustainable plan. It's a blank check that I cannot write. I tried to lay out the facts as neutrally as possible, as if presenting a patient's case history. I have a mortgage on my condo that costs more than your rent. I have over $200,000 in student loans from medical school that I will be paying for the next 15 years. I have my own retirement to fund, my own life. My salary is not just a number in a bank account. It's allocated. It has jobs to do. Noah burst out laughing, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. Oh, come on, Ava, but you're a surgeon. You must make, like, $500,000 a year or something. He said it with such wide-eyed innocence, as if I were complaining about the price of caviar. Liam held up a hand to quiet him, but the damage was done. The wall of their willful ignorance was solidifying right before my eyes. They weren't listening to my words. They were listening to the myth they'd created about me. Noah, that's not the point, Liam said, trying to sound like the reasonable one. The point, Ava, is that we are talking about Mom's life. Your mortgage isn't life or death. Your student loans aren't life or death. This is. We're just asking you to reprioritize. For the family. For Mom. He said it so smoothly, twisting my financial responsibility into a selfish indulgence, a petty obstacle in the face of their noble cause. My future was a luxury item they felt I should discard. My gaze slid past them, past a silent and pale Susan, and landed on my father. He was my last hope, my final appeal. I stared at him, my eyes begging him to step in, to be the father, to say, "This isn't fair to Ava, we can't ask this of her." He met my gaze for a fleeting second, and in that moment, I saw it all. It wasn't malice. It was worse. It was a silent, desperate hope that I would just agree, that I would take the burden from his shoulders. He was sacrificing me on the altar of his fear. In that instant, the room shifted. The cozy living room of my childhood home became a boardroom, and I was on the wrong side of the table. They weren't my family anymore. They were a board of directors, and my entire life's work had just been declared their primary asset. My success was no longer my own. It was the common fund, and I was just beginning to understand the terrifying price of being the sole contributor. What's the true cost of help that isn't helpful at all? In surgery, we call it an iatrogenic injury, a problem caused by the treatment itself. In the weeks that followed our family tribunal, I learned that my stepbrother's help was a classic iatrogenic injury to our family's already failing health. They had started their new jobs as Susan's caretakers with a zeal that was both impressive and, as it turned out, utterly useless. The first test of our new arrangement was Susan's follow-up appointment with the specialist in New York. Liam, as the designated driver, was supposed to pick her and my father up at 7 in the morning for the 4-hour drive. At 7:15, my father called me, his voice tight with anxiety. Liam wasn't there. He wasn't answering his phone. I called, my own calls going straight to voicemail. Finally, at almost 8, a text from Liam arrived. "Overslept. So sorry. On my way now." He showed up at 8:30, unapologetic and reeking of stale beer, turning a critical medical appointment into a frantic, high-speed race down the interstate. They arrived at the clinic 45 minutes late, earning a sharp reprimand from the office manager and nearly forfeiting their slot. I got the full, stressed-out report from my father that evening. Liam's contribution wasn't help, it was chaos. He had added a layer of profound, unnecessary stress onto an already terrifying day, and I was the one who had to manage my father's panic from 100 miles away. Noah's domain was the kitchen. He had declared he would cook all of Susan's meals, focusing on a healthy, anti-inflammatory diet he'd researched on a blog. The first night, I came over after a 10-hour shift to find the place looking like a culinary war zone. Every pot and pan they owned was dirty, the counter was sticky with spilled turmeric, and a thick haze of burnt garlic hung in the air. In the center of the mess was a small, sad-looking bowl of quinoa and steamed kale. Noah was beaming with pride. "Made her a superfood bowl," he announced. My father was in the living room, reading, oblivious. Susan was in her room, too tired to eat. And I spent the next hour cleaning the kitchen, because who else was going to do it? Then came the invoices. They started as a trickle and quickly became a flood. A text from Liam with a picture of a gas receipt. $47 for the New York trip. A Venmo request from Noah. $112 for organic groceries. Another from Liam. $25 for parking at the hospital. It was breathtaking in its audacity. They weren't just failing to provide meaningful support, they were billing me for the privilege of their incompetence. Each notification on my phone felt like a tiny paper cut. This wasn't a family coming together. This was a poorly run business for which I was the sole, involuntary funder. They were performing their roles with just enough effort to claim they were contributing, while the actual work, the emotional support, the cleanup, the management of logistics and anxiety, still fell to me. Their help was a carefully constructed performance designed to justify my role as the bank. It was a parasitic relationship disguised as a partnership, and with every Venmo request, the price of my ticket to this family theater was going up. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money, it was about my soul. Do you know what the most painful kind of betrayal is? It's not the loud, dramatic kind. It's the quiet kind. The betrayal of silence. The one that happens when the person who is supposed to be your staunchest defender simply stands aside and watches you get devoured. It was a silence I could no longer endure. I found my father alone in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of history in his leather-bound books, and I decided it was time to excavate our own. I had the latest Venmo request from Liam for gas and tolls pulled up on my phone, a small digital insult that felt like the final straw. I walked in without knocking. "Dad, we need to talk." He looked up from a book on the Punic Wars, his expression one of weary apprehension. He knew this was coming. He set the book down, marking his page. "Of course, Ava, what is it?" he asked, as if he didn't have the slightest idea. "Why aren't you saying anything?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, all the surgical precision stripped away, leaving only the raw nerve. "Why are you letting them do this? You see what's happening. You see how they're using me, how they're billing me for their own incompetence. You're my father. Your silence. It feels like a consent form. It feels like you're holding me down while they pick my pockets." The words tumbled out, more accusation than question. He had the grace to look ashamed. He couldn't meet my eyes, instead focusing on a fixed point on his dusty bookshelf. "It's not that simple, Ava," he mumbled, his voice thick with a guilt that did nothing to soothe me. "Simple? Dad, they've appointed me the unlimited treasury for this family, and their only contribution is to send me receipts. What part of that isn't simple? You are letting them sacrifice my future to preserve their comfortable present." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were glistening. The guilt was real, the weakness was real, and the fear was paralyzing. "Ava, I love Susan," he said, his voice cracking. "When your mother died, I thought my life was over. Susan, she brought the world back into color. I cannot lose her. I will do anything not to lose her." He was pleading with me, laying his heart bare not as a defense, but as an explanation for his treason. Then came the final devastating blow. "And her boys?" Liam and Noah, they're good kids, but they just don't have the opportunities that you do. They don't have your strength, your career." He leaned forward, his voice dropping, his words weaving a cage of obligation around me. "You went to medical school. You built this incredible life. You're our only hope. Forgive me, but you are the only one who can save her. Who can save us?" And there it was. My success was not my shield. It was my sacrifice. My strength was not my asset. It was the family's emergency resource. He wasn't a villain. He was a terrified man, clinging to the wreckage of his second chance at happiness. And he was using his own daughter as a life raft. He was appealing not to justice, not to fairness, but to my love for him and his fear of being alone. And in that quiet, book-lined room, I finally understood. I was utterly, completely on my own. What do you do when you realize the people you love are treating your life like a natural resource to be plundered? The conversation with my father was not a breakdown, it was a diagnosis. The emotional approach was gangrenous, and the only way to save the patient, in this case, me, was amputation. I had to cut away the diseased hope that they would ever treat me fairly. The time for talking was over. The time for contracts had begun. The next morning, I didn't call my father back to argue. I called a financial consultant. His name was Arthur Vance, a man in his late 50s with a voice as calm and dry as old paper. I didn't tell him the whole story. I simply said I was considering a significant, high-risk, long-term philanthropic commitment and needed to understand the absolute upper limit of what I could contribute without jeopardizing my own financial future. For 2 hours, we went through everything: my income, my debt, my retirement goals. It was a cold, clinical process, and it was exactly what I needed. My second call was to a lawyer, Jessica Albright, a name I got from a senior partner at the hospital. I was clearer with her. "I want to create a trust," I explained, "a targeted medical fund for a family member. I will be the initial and primary donor, but my contribution must be a one-time fixed sum. I need the legal framework to ensure it cannot be treated as a down payment on a lifetime of financial support." She didn't ask about the family drama. She just said, "Ironclad, I understand completely." For the next week, I moved with the detached efficiency of a surgeon prepping for a complex procedure. Arthur gave me a number. It was enormous, a figure that made my stomach clench, but it was one that I could survive. Jessica drafted the documents, creating a legal entity called the Susan Miller Medical Trust. The language was precise, stripped of all sentiment. It was a machine designed for a single purpose: to pay for cancer treatment and nothing else. My emotions were a liability, so I locked them away. Then, I built my ultimatum. I sat at my desk and drafted a one-page summary of the plan. I would deposit $300,000 into the trust to begin funding the treatment. This was my act of love, sealed in a legal document. But it was conditional. I would only make the deposit after they, as a family, had also contributed. My father would have to liquidate his collection of first edition history books. Liam and Noah would have to sell their late father's classic Mustang that they were so proud of. And both of them would have to secure full-time employment and provide their first 2 pay stubs as proof. I called the meeting. Not at their house, but at my condo, my territory. They arrived looking wary but expectant, like a delegation coming to hear the terms of a surrender they assumed would be mine. I didn't offer them drinks. I asked them to sit at my dining room table, and I handed each of them a thin folder. Inside was a copy of the trust agreement and my one-page summary. "I've found a way forward," I said, my voice as sterile as a scalpel. "This is the plan." I let them read in silence. I watched their faces shift from curiosity to confusion, and then to a slow boiling rage. The air grew thick and hot. This wasn't the tearful capitulation they had expected. This was a treaty, a business proposal. I had taken their emotional blackmail and translated it into the cold, hard language of finance and law. I had just performed a radical surgery on the concept of our family, and as they stared at the papers, their knuckles white, I had no idea if the patient would survive. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment respect dies? It doesn't make a sound. It's just a sudden, cold vacuum in the room. I watched it happen in the eyes of the three men sitting at my dining room table. The initial shock on their faces as they read my proposal had curdled into something much uglier. It was a dark, gathering storm of personal offense. They weren't seeing a solution. They were seeing a rebellion. Liam was the first to speak. He tossed the folder onto the table as if it were contaminated. "Is this a joke, Ava?" he asked, his voice dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost impressive. "A trust? Lawyers? What is this? Are you dissolving a partnership? We're talking about our mother, and you come back with legal documents as if you're buying a corporation. This is insane." He looked at me as if I were a stranger, a hostile entity that had taken the place of his stepsister. Noah, ever the more direct instrument, slammed his own folder down. "You want us to sell the Mustang?" he spat, his face flushed with anger. "Our dad's car? The only real thing we have left of him? You want us to get jobs and hand you our pay stubs like we're delinquent teenagers reporting to a parole officer? What kind of heartless clinical thing is this to do to your own family?" He was practically shaking with indignation, his voice rising with every word. It was my father's reaction that landed the heaviest blow. He just stared at the papers, his face a mask of wounded disbelief. "This formalism, Ava," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's so cold. We're a family. We were supposed to be in this together. This document, it turns Susan's life into a business transaction. It puts a price on everything. It's like you're trading her health for our dignity." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "We're not a corporation," he cried out, the words a raw, painful summary of his entire worldview. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for me. This was the most important diagnostic moment of all. Their rage wasn't about the money. I was offering a life-changing sum. It wasn't about their mother's health. This plan was the only viable way to pay for her treatment. Their fury was about the conditions. It was about accountability. I had dared to ask them to have skin in the game, and they were reacting as if I had physically assaulted them. This wasn't a family fighting for a loved one. This was a board of dependents furious that their sole benefactor was demanding they contribute to the enterprise. I took a slow breath, keeping my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me. I refused to let my voice shake. "This isn't a negotiation," I said, my tone even and low. "This isn't a punishment. This is the only help I am able to give. It is a plan for survival. For Susan's survival, and for mine." I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze as steady as a surgeon's hand. "The $300,000 is on the table. The trust is ready to be funded. The next move is yours." They stared back at me, their faces a mixture of fury and disbelief. They truly believed I was bluffing. They were so certain of their moral high ground, so accustomed to my role as the provider, that they could not comprehend this new reality. They thought that if they just yelled loud enough, if they just applied enough emotional pressure, the old Ava would reemerge and write the checks without question. They rejected my plan, not with a discussion, but with a unified wall of indignant silence. The battle lines were drawn, and they were all waiting for me to be the first one to break. The 3 days following my ultimatum were a special kind of loud. It was a silence filled with slammed doors I could hear from across town, with angry, unsent text messages, and with the stubborn, resentful pride of men who would rather be right than be helpful. They were engaged in a strategic standoff, a war of attrition, fully expecting me to crack under the weight of my own conscience. They didn't understand. A surgeon's conscience is a muscle, exercised daily. It knows the difference between saving a life and enabling a pathology. I was in the middle of reviewing post-op x-rays when my phone rang, vibrating against the cool, smooth surface of the light box. It was my father. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was the first volley in a new campaign of emotional warfare. But something made me answer. A flicker of instinct. "Hello?" I said, my voice clipped and professional. What I heard on the other end was not anger. It was the sound of a man's world shattering. "Ava. Oh God, Ava. It's Susan. You have to come. We're at Boston General." My surgeon's brain took over before my daughter's heart had a chance to break. The wall between emotion and action slammed into place. What happened? Dad, talk to me? Was it a fall? Did she lose consciousness? What were her vitals in the ambulance? My questions were rapid fire, a clinical checklist designed to cut through his panic. "She just collapsed," he sobbed. "She was trying to get a glass of water and she just folded. Her breathing is so shallow." I was already grabbing my keys, my white coat still on. "I'm on my way." When I pushed through the double doors of the emergency department, I found them huddled in a small alcove of the waiting room. They looked like shipwreck survivors on a small, sterile island. My father, gray-faced and hollow-eyed. Liam, pacing a tiny three-step path, running his hands through his hair. Noah, slumped in a chair, staring at his phone as if it held the answers to the universe. They looked up as I approached, their faces a mixture of desperation and, for the first time, a flicker of fear. They needed me now, not as a bank, but as a doctor. I didn't stop to talk. I walked straight to the nurse's station, flashed my hospital ID, and asked for the attending physician on Susan's case. 5 minutes later, a tired-looking doctor named Evans was walking me through her chart. "The cancer is progressing faster than we thought, Dr. Hassan," he said, his voice low and direct. "Her blood pressure is dangerously low and she's severely dehydrated. The tumor isn't waiting for a family consensus. We need to start the immunotherapy infusion. Not tomorrow, not this evening, now." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it. The ticking clock had just gone from a quiet tick-tock to a blaring alarm. "I understand," I said. "What do you need from me?" Dr. Evans looked at me, his expression softening with a hint of professional sympathy. "I need you to talk to your family," he said. "We can't start a multi-thousand-dollar treatment cycle without a guarantee of payment. Admissions needs a deposit of $75,000 before we can even send the order to the pharmacy. The clock is ticking." I walked back over to the 3 men who were still waiting for a miracle. I looked at their anxious faces, and for the first time in weeks, I felt nothing. No anger, no pity. Just a cold, hard clarity. "I just spoke with her doctor," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. "Her condition is critical. They have to start the treatment immediately, or we risk losing her within the next 24 hours. I let that sink in, watching the blood drain from my father's face. Then I delivered the final, fatal blow to their strategy. "But they won't start until they receive a deposit. Today. Now. The arguments are over. The time for discussion has run out." There is a unique power that comes from being the only person in a crisis who knows exactly what to do. In that sterile, antiseptic-smelling hospital corridor, I watched the 3 men who had spent weeks trying to control me completely fall apart. My father looked as if he might faint, his hand pressed against the wall for support. Liam started running his hands through his hair again, faster and faster, a frantic, useless engine of anxiety. Noah just stared at me, his mouth agape, his blustering anger from a few days ago completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a child. Their emotional leverage had evaporated. Reality had just cashed in. They were all looking at me, but I didn't give them the answer they were silently begging for. I didn't say, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Instead, I turned and walked, my footsteps echoing down the hall toward the admissions office. It was a short walk, but it felt like a mile. With every step, I felt the final frayed threads of my old obligations snapping. I was no longer acting as a daughter or a stepsister. The part of me that yearned for their approval, that flinched at their disappointment, had finally gone quiet. I was acting as a physician. I was acting as a human being. Inside the small glass-walled office, a woman with tired eyes looked up at me. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm here to make a deposit for a patient, Susan Miller." I took out my phone and my wallet. It took 2 credit cards and a direct transfer from my savings account to cover the $75,000 deposit. I watched the numbers drain from my accounts on the screen, a cascade of pixels representing years of my life. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a choice, a decision I was making on my own terms. When I walked back out into the hallway, they were still standing exactly where I had left them, frozen in a tableau of helplessness. My father looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic gratitude. "Ava, thank you," he whispered. "I knew you would." I held up a hand, cutting him off. The time for his gratitude, which had always come at my expense, was over. I looked directly at him, then at Liam, then at Noah, making sure I had their undivided attention. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of steel. "Let's be perfectly clear," I said. "I did not do that for you." I gestured down the hall in the direction of Susan's room. "I did that for her, because she is a good person who is sick and deserves a chance to live. I did it because it is the right thing to do." I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us, sharp and precise as a row of scalpels. But my offer has not changed. The trust, the conditions. That is the only path forward. I have started the engine, but you are going to have to find the fuel. I had done more than just pay a bill. I had taken away their last and most powerful weapon, Susan's life. They could no longer hold her health hostage in our negotiations. They could no longer use the urgency of her illness as a tool to manipulate me. I had met the immediate crisis, but I had refused to absorb the long-term responsibility. I had performed the emergency surgery, but now it was up to them to participate in the recovery. I looked at their stunned, silent faces and knew, with absolute certainty, that the power dynamic in our family had just been permanently, irrevocably rewritten. Have you ever had to break something in order to fix it? In orthopedic surgery, sometimes you have to re-break a bone that has healed improperly. It's a violent, controlled act designed to create the opportunity for true, aligned healing. In the days after Susan's hospitalization, I realized I had just done the same thing to my family. I had shattered our dysfunctional dynamic, and now we had to see if it could be set right. There was no going back. Reality, stripped of all emotional padding, had finally arrived. Faced with an ultimatum that was no longer negotiable, the men in my family finally, reluctantly, began to move. The first sign of surrender came from my father. He called me 3 days after I paid the hospital deposit, his voice quiet and devoid of its usual bluster. He told me he had contacted a rare book appraiser. He didn't sound happy about it. He sounded like a man amputating a phantom limb, but he was doing it. The collection of first edition histories, his life's passion, his connection to a world more orderly than his own, was going on the auction block. The next crack in the wall came from Liam. 2 weeks later, I received a forwarded email from him. It was a job offer from a small IT consulting firm. The salary was modest, but the title was real. Junior Project Coordinator. There was a start date. There was a benefits package. He hadn't just gotten a job. He had entered the world of adult responsibility. His only comment in the email was a single, stark sentence. My first paycheck will be on the 21st of the month. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. It was the first brick in a new foundation. Noah was the last holdout, his pride the most deeply wounded. But even he could not hold out against the relentless pressure of the hospital's billing department. A week after Liam's email, my father called to inform me that Noah had sold the Mustang. He got $12,000 for it, a fraction of what it was worth to him emotionally. The next day, he started working shifts at a high-end Italian restaurant downtown. He was bussing tables and washing dishes, a humbling physical labor that was the polar opposite of the life he had envisioned for himself. The first contributions to the Susan Miller Medical Trust were not celebratory. They were funeral rites for old versions of themselves. My father's check from the auction house was for $87,000. Liam and Noah's first joint deposit, from the sale of the car and their first paychecks, was just over $14,000. They were modest sums compared to my own contribution, but they were not insignificant. They represented the first real, tangible sacrifices they had ever made. They were finally putting skin in the game. That weekend, we all met at the hospital to visit Susan. She was through her first round of treatment and was weak but lucid, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. We didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about the trust or the sale of the books or the Mustang. We just sat together in that quiet, sunlit room, the beeping of the IV pump a steady rhythm beneath our conversation. We were no longer performing the play of the perfect blended family. We were just a group of flawed, fractured people, united by a difficult, shared purpose. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time, it felt real. How do you measure the healing of a family? It's not in the scar tissue, which always remains. You measure it in the silence. A year after Susan's collapse, the silence in my father's house was different. It was no longer the loud, weaponized silence of resentment. It was a comfortable, easy quiet, the kind that grows in the spaces between people who no longer need to perform for one another. That, I decided, was the sound of a wound that had finally, cleanly, closed. Susan was in her garden, a place she hadn't had the strength to tend in over a year. She was in remission, a fragile but beautiful word. The medical bills still arrived with relentless regularity, but they were no longer a source of panic. They were just logistics. On the 5th of every month, an email would arrive in my inbox, a statement from the trust. It would show my father's monthly contribution from his pension and 2 separate deposits from Liam and Noah. They were never late. They were never a dollar short. It was the steady, predictable rhythm of a shared burden. The change in my stepbrothers was the most startling transformation. They carried themselves differently. Liam had been promoted to a team lead at his IT firm. He complained about his subordinates with the weary pride of a true manager. Noah, to everyone's surprise, had discovered a passion for cooking. He was now a line cook at the restaurant where he'd started as a dishwasher, and he spoke about flavor profiles and knife skills with an intensity he'd never had for anything else in his life. The aimless, entitled boys were gone, replaced by men who were tired, stressed, and for the first time, genuinely proud. One cool autumn afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with Susan, watching the leaves fall. My father and the boys were inside, arguing loudly and happily over a football game. "Thank you, Ava," Susan said softly, her eyes on the brilliant red of a maple tree at the edge of the yard. You saved my life. I know that, and I will never have the words to truly thank you. I started to say something, to deflect, but she held up a hand. But that's not the most important thing you did. She turned to face me, her gaze clear and direct. You saved my sons, she said, her voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I love them so much that I was letting them drown in my love. I made it too easy for them to be boys. You did the hard thing. You loved all of us enough to demand we be better. You didn't just save me from the cancer, Ava. You saved this family from itself by showing it what it was really made of. Her words settled over me, a profound and quiet peace. I looked past her, into the house, at the messy, imperfect, loud group of people who were my family. I hadn't destroyed them by drawing a line in the sand. I had given them a foundation to build upon. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the most profound act of love isn't to give, but to demand. To refuse to be the sole pillar of support, and instead, to insist that everyone learn to stand on their own, together. The debt was finally, truly shared.